In the 3rd century, the Christian apologist and theologian Tertullian wrote, "We feel pained should any wine or bread, even though our own, be cast upon the ground." On this Corpus Christi Sunday, as we commemorate the institution of this sacrament of the body and blood of Christ, I wanted to reflect on the importance of reverence for the Holy Eucharist. Last year, I was appointed to the ACNA committee to prepare the official traditional language adaptation of the new 2019 Book of Common Prayer. That traditional adaptation should be approved and published sometime next year. And to begin our work, we all got an advanced digital copy in February of the book that was the result of the bishop's final approval in January, all ready for publication. My sections to handle are the Collects and the Easter Vigil, but I began looking over the rest of the book as well. Overall, I was very impressed by what I saw. Really, to sum it up, it skillfully weaves together some of the best of the 1928 and 1979 editions. But when I got to page 141, I was horrified at what I found there. It's the additional directions section of the rubrics for the Eucharistic rite. It noted that apart from what sacrament is to be reserved, the remaining consecrated hosts are consumed. So far, so good, everything normal. But my heart sank at the closing sentence, quote, "The wine shall likewise be consumed, or reverently poured in a place set aside for that purpose." It was a very odd statement in that the only place that has ever been set aside for that purpose in all of Christian history is the throat of a baptized person. I didn't remember this being in the draft liturgy put out several years ago when things started to be put together, and they put it out and asked for feedback. I went back and checked. It wasn't there. The rubric that was there at the time was fully orthodox and in line with all the previous prayer books, basically saying that what is not reserved is fully consumed. But there was a revised version issued a few years later that turned out to be even worse than the final version. It said, quote, "The wine shall likewise be consumed or reverently poured upon untrodden ground," which means that the final version had the piscina in mind. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's a sink in the sacristy, and in some places in the sanctuary, that empties out onto the ground rather than into the sewer system. And to be absolutely clear, the precious blood should never be poured down the piscina. That really is only for things like blessed salt, holy water, and the water that comes from washing the linens. In fact, pouring the precious blood down the piscina is a sacrilege, mishandling holy things, whether you intend to or not. In fact, in the Roman Catholic Church, you are automatically excommunicated for doing such a thing. And only the Pope can lift that category of excommunication. If you're a cleric, you can also be defrocked. So this is extremely serious. Well, what to do? Since the bishops had already approved the final draft, that's how we got it, I figured the fate of the book was in the hands of the provincial assembly. So I used the resources I know about. I made a video explaining the issue and wrote letters to as many bishops and delegates as I could find. Father Junkin joyfully joined in his own letter writing campaign. I found out later that the prayer book was not going to be brought up for a vote at the assembly. Probably because of the lingering animosity about being forced to use the new book back in 1979. Rather than being adopted by canon, as I would have expected, it was simply going to be offered by the bishops to the church, to anyone who wanted to use it, and those who didn't have to. And this worked out in my favor. So I didn't have to convince hundreds of delegates to vote against it, to go against the grain. Just a dozen or so bishops to take action. Several wrote back to me, indicating their support and encouragement, and the Archbishop himself wrote back to me and said he would put it on the agenda for the June House of Bishops meeting. It was also probably fortuitous that the book had a few typos that needed to be fixed anyway for the next printing. And I'm pleased to say that the bishops did take up the issue that I raised, and that the rubric has been changed, starting with the next printing of the book. Now, I haven't seen the corrected text yet. As I understand, they did not simply return it to the original version, but they did change it to reflect consumption as the reverent way to treat the sacramental elements that are not reserved. And I do want to personally express publicly my thanks to our Bishop-elect Ryan Reed for enthusiastically taking up the cause and arguing the case with the bishops. In fact, he was, again, probably providentially, uniquely positioned as both the leader of our diocesan delegation, as well as being invited in as a guest to the House of Bishops meeting as our bishop-elect. Well, after all the hubbub, I'm still left asking the question, why? And how could we have erred so badly? How did we enshrine in our prayer book a practice that other Christians who share our Eucharistic doctrines rightly condemn as a sacrilege? Now, it is true that mishandling the consecrated wine is a very common liturgical abuse, both in Anglican and Roman Catholic parishes. But the proper way to handle that is with awareness and training and discipline, rather than by changing liturgical law to accommodate the abuse, and thereby making everything all legal. As St. Leo the Great expressed it in his famous Ascension Day sermon, quote, "Our Redeemer's visible presence has passed into the sacraments." It's no wonder that the Christians of the early centuries had a great love of our Lord and the Holy Eucharist. Some, even, like St. Tarsicius, were martyred to protect it, just as they laid down their lives to protect the Holy Scriptures. We wouldn't let our Bibles or other holy objects be cast upon the ground. In fact, such tactics are often used by those who violently persecute the church. I don't think we would even allow our neighbor's Koran to touch the ground out of respect for our fellow human beings. Nor do we properly allow the U.S. flag to touch the ground. How could we in good conscience treat the Holy Eucharist this way? Now, in considering why, some people might point to a decline in the belief of the real presence. And surely that must be at least part of the explanation. And if St. Paul told us in 1 Corinthians that we eat and drink judgment if we do so not recognizing the Lord's body, should we expect to be found guiltless if we treat the sacrament in a way that does not recognize the Lord's body and blood? Frankly, when I discovered the problem with the rubric, I was moved to action, especially because I feared the judgment of God. I feared it for myself if I didn't do something about what I knew to be right, and for our church to ever condone such a thing. There's no doubt, certainly, that we have a lot of work to do regarding belief in the real presence. The truth that Jesus Christ, body, soul, and divinity, is there under the forms of bread and wine and the Holy Eucharist. We need to constantly teach Orthodox Christian Catholic doctrine on this matter. But I don't think that's all that's going on here. After all, a C of E study, that's Church of England, for those who don't know, specifically pointed out, quote, "This provision for reverent consumption dates back to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and has helped to hold in unity worshipers with a variety of understandings of Christ's presence in the Eucharist." There's certainly no doubt about the old-fashioned Low Churchman and his devout handling of these kinds of things. So I think another part of the problem is our disconnect of body and spirit. It's that old heresy of Gnosticism resurfacing again and again as it does. One might ask, if you pour it out reverently, how can it still be a sacrilege? But reverence is not just about your feelings, how you feel about it, not even primarily about feelings. It's about the fittingness of our actions, the things we do with our bodies, not just what goes on in our head. The idea that the moral reality of a situation is governed by our feelings stems from the logical fallacy called solipsism. For example, when the Ark of the Covenant was being brought back from captivity by the Philistines to be returned to Jerusalem, you can read about this in 2 Samuel 6, the oxen stumbled along the road, jarring the cart, and to keep it from falling off the cart, a man named Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark and make sure it was safe. He was immediately struck dead by God. According to Numbers 4:15, whenever the ark had to be transported, and it wasn't that often, this special class of priests that Uzzah belonged to were instructed not to touch any of the sacred objects on pain of death. So they were very deliberate and explicit and serious about this whole process. I think undoubtedly Uzzah reached out with love and devotion. He reached out because he cared, not wanting any harm to come to this sacred vessel. However, in doing so, he acted in defiance of the clear commandment given directly by God and recorded in the Holy Scriptures. So while he may have felt reverent, his action was not. It was an action of defiance of what he had been told by the Lord. And we're explicitly told in the record in the Bible that the anger of the Lord was kindled against him because of this disobedience. He was not willing to learn from the Lord how to properly handle holy things. He was, in essence, carefree about it, and it cost him his life. When St. Paul chided some of the Corinthians for receiving communion improperly, not recognizing the Lord's body, he added, "Anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment upon himself. That is why some of you are weak and ill, and some have died." God demands that we be good stewards of his gifts, and the more holy and precious the gift, the greater the responsibility in making use of it properly, not just with pious feelings, but also in reverent actions. Grant us, we beseech thee, O Lord, so to venerate the sacred mysteries of thy body and blood, that we may ever perceive within ourselves the fruit of thy redemption. Amen.